Namaskar and welcome to Indian Diplomacy, show on India's national broadcaster, Doordarshan, about Indian foreign policy, India's international relations, and key developments in different regions of the world that have a bearing on India's rise. Viewers, in this episode, we are going east towards a brewing conflict between two traditional rivals in the eastern end of the Indo-Pacific, China and Japan. Comments by the Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi have led to a huge maelstrom, with the Chinese trying to hit back in different dimensions and escalating the conflict. And the United States has been drawn in, and India also cannot be sitting on the sidelines, because this impacts the security of Asia and the balance of power in the whole region. So we are going to be talking about the China-Japan conflict over Taiwan and its wider ramifications. And to discuss this, I have with me two outstanding young professionals who are closely following this issue. Let me introduce you to them. Simran Walia is a research analyst at the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defence Studies and Analyses, an important national think tank. Simran, welcome to Indian Diplomacy.
Thank you. Thank you so much, sir, for having me here.
And I have with me Jyotsna Mehra, who is an international affairs professional and founder of Closed Door Policy Consulting and is a Indo-Pacific watcher. Jyotsna, welcome to Indian Diplomacy.
Thank you, sir. Looking forward.
Thank you. Let me start with you, Simran. So the Prime Minister of Japan says something about, a survival threatening situation involving the independence and security of Taiwan. And immediately the Chinese, join this with howls of protests and so much more. But let's start with the Japanese interests first, which you closely track. Lately, their leaders have been involved in saying things more openly about the need to defend Taiwan, which is under threat from Chinese, plans to take over or reunify, as the Chinese call it. So let's start with why this is a survival threatening situation in the first place. And the Japanese say that we are facing the most complex and dangerous security environment since World War II. And Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi has maybe made it more open, but it has been there, right, for a long time. Japanese strategy involves the defense of Taiwan. And so let's talk about why Taiwan is so critical for Japanese security and even for their very existence.
Thank you, Professor Chaulia, for your question. So as we all are aware, Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi recently took office. And so this specific statement of her and remarks of her on China and Taiwan, that if China invades Taiwan, it would also, Japan would also possibly retaliate militarily. So this specific survival threatening situation that PM Takaichi talked about actually refers to Japan's 2015 security law, which is basically the reinterpretation of Article 9 of the Constitution of Japan, which allows Japan's self-defense forces to engage in collective self-defense. So this is actually what, according to PM Takaichi, she was referring to, and which in return urged Beijing. So basically, no previous post-World War II Japanese government, even that of the militarist Shinzo Abe, as we all are very much aware of, he never publicly, indicated that Tokyo would ever go to war with China. Specifically, of course, because of the Article 9 of the Constitution. And even when Beijing asked Japan and PM to retract his statement, Takaichi explicitly refused, saying that Japan's stance on Taiwan has remained consistent ever since, and that it was actually her responsibility to protect and maximize Japan's national security interests. So basically, importance of Taiwan for Japan, I would say that if we look at Taiwan geographically, Taiwan lies very close to Japan's southwestern islands, and the distance from Taiwan to some of these Japan's southwestern islands is such as the Yonaguni Island. It's around 110 kilometers only. So if we say that China is invading Taiwan in the near future, this would, of course, affect Japan's security as well, because of the distance and the proximity that we are witnessing. And because of this proximity, any large-scale military operation in Taiwan would affect Japanese airspace, maritime zones, and or even the Japanese territory per se. And in fact, the rift between China and Japan deepened further with Tokyo's plans to deploy missiles on the island close to Taiwan. So Japanese Defense Minister Shinjiro Koizumi recently visited this military base at the Yonaguni Island. And, he said that deployment can help lower the chance of an armed attack. So
deterrence
yes,
measure.
I think this reflects that how Japan is somewhat trying to prepare for the potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan. And strategically also, I would say that Taiwan functions as is part of the so-called first island chain. And so control over Taiwan would give a state, and here I'm referring to China, of course, the domination to, ability to dominate a choke point that constrains access to the Pacific, which would threaten Japan's sea lanes of communication. And if we talk about economically about the Taiwan's importance to Japan, I would say that Japan has been heavily dependent on maritime trade and energy supplies, natural resources, and the flow of goods majorly pass to the sea lanes that are near or through the Taiwan Strait and the adjacent waters. So if those sea lanes are disrupted at any given point, this by a naval blockade or increased military patrolling, this would, of course, Japan's ability to import an essential resources and export manufacturers goods would be severely disrupted. And hence, if Taiwan were under hostile, Japan's economic lifelines would also be disrupted. Let's say potentially threatening domestic stability, industrial output. Also, importantly, 80% of Japan's maritime commercial trade passes via the Taiwan Strait. Also, Japan has been majorly of the view, as you also mentioned, that Japan is seeing the strategic threats. And even in Japan's recently revised national security strategy in December 2022, we saw that Japan clearly and explicitly mentioned China as a strategic threat. This is also one of the reasons why Japan is trying to build its defense build-up. And the new Prime Minister Takaichi sort of mentioned that she would be aiming to increase the defense spending also by 2% by, in fact, 2026, which was earlier aimed at 2027. So this also sort of shows how Japan is trying to rebuild its defense build-up because of the emerging
balance of power is shifting against Japan, and so they are concerned. Yes, absolutely. So these are all reasons, legitimate reasons, I think, for the Japanese to want to defend Taiwan. Let me bring in Jyotsna as well. Jyotsna, the Chinese reaction we have seen has been hysterical. They've just gone ballistic, and is in all directions. They have been attacking Prime Minister of Japan on social media with very, very undiplomatic language. They've been, they've complained to the United Nations saying that it's some kind of a, an intervention in their internal affairs and all that. And secondly, they're also, using other economic tools of coercion, like a tourist boycott of Chinese in Japan. Seafood from Japan has been halted imports into China. And they're trying to basically, impose their version of the regional geography and the regional history on all the neighbors, right? So the question is, why is China being so oversensitive or touchy, and what is their intent in escalating this so much? Do they have plans to invade Taiwan? And do you think these kind of interventions by Japan may be throwing a spanner in the wheels for the Chinese?
Thank you, Professor Chaulia. As you rightly said, that Chinese reaction has been hysterical, especially if you have a look at what Prime Minister Takaichi actually said. It might be different from what has been said before by Japanese prime ministers, but her remarks were framed very much in a self-defense lens. So it was more to do with how Japan would react if China were to invade Taiwan. And in response to that, China has appealed to the UN, and it's appealed to an obsolete enemy clause in the UN, which no longer applies, which is to do with how permanent founding members of the UN Security Council could, in fact, take action against the former three Axis powers, Japan, Germany, and Italy. So they've appealed to an obsolete law, and they know that it's an obsolete law. At the same time, like you said, they've put restrictions on Japanese seafood, and there have been flight cancellations. There are disruptions to tourism, film industry, and so on and so forth. And in fact, yes, like you said, senior Chinese diplomats stationed in Japan have issued violent threats against Prime Minister Takaichi. if one
It's
were
like
to think
wolf
about it,
warrior at a more amplified
exactly.
level. Yeah.
And one would think that why would China do this at a time when China is in fact resetting its ties with many of these regional countries, and why would it go out of its way to ruffle these feathers? One reason for that would exactly be that China thinks that it's bolstered and it has more confidence now because President Trump is seeking a deal with the Chinese, which makes them want to ruffle these feathers. But in addition, there is also this view about Prime Minister Takaichi that she is a China hawk. So they are possibly testing how much of a hawk is she really? And what is she actually going to do beyond rhetoric? So this is to give her a signal that there will be consequences if you touch the core of our core interest, which is Taiwan. And that's what China is doing here. Having said all this, this is not the first time China has reacted in such a hysterical manner. If we remember the pandemic, China reacted quite similarly with Australia, when Australia ordered a probe into the origins of the Wuhan virus.
Correct.
And also they've reacted in the past by imposing sort of tourism bans against South Korea when they deployed THAAD missiles. So this is not extraordinary in that lens, but China is trying to signal that Taiwan is our core interest, and no matter how much of a hawk you are, we're going to test what you're actually going to do.
Yeah, so whether China is provoked or whether they're provoking, I mean, it's like a, matter of interpretation, but quite clearly, as Jyotsna, you are saying, there is a kind of a trend or a pattern to China trying to impose their will and trying to make everybody else kowtow to their, diktats. And we're clearly seeing that in this episode as well. And that is, of course, linked to their territorial expansion and ambition and the hegemonic intent, which is a matter of major concern. Coming back to Simran, both Sanae Takaichi and President Xi Jinping, both of them engaged with President Donald Trump of the US after this flare-up. And it's interesting that Trump first spoke to Xi Jinping and then to Sanae Takaichi. And the American role obviously cannot be, left out of this discussion, because the basic grudge of China has always been, for decades, is that Japan is a part of the US alliance, right? And Japan stations American forces and troops and power projection, and that Japan is acting to contain China as a pawn of the US, isn't it? That's how the Chinese view this whole situation. So what is the US role here? I mean, some are arguing that actually Trump may have even asked Prime Minister of Japan to lower the tensions and to not escalate because he has a trade deal going on with the Chinese. On the other hand, US-Japan alliance remains strong on the ground, in the waters. They're continuing to invest in upgrading US military presence and the joint naval cooperation and all those things, right? So what is the, the crux of this US-Japan alliance right now, the way you see it and the way Trump has responded?
Okay, so the fact that President Donald Trump made a call to first President Xi Jinping and then Prime Minister Takaichi itself tells a lot, I think. So basically, what I personally feel is that President Donald Trump, I think, is trying to reaffirm its alliance commitments in a way through US-Japan alliance, and also at the same time trying to maintain a careful balancing act with China. So, of course, as we all are very much aware of the fact that China and Japan are having tensions since a long time due to the island disputes and all of that. But so that is one reason why President Donald Trump is trying to maintain a balancing act with China. So even in the US Department of Defense issued a statement in which they called the US-Japan alliance a cornerstone of peace, security, and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific, reaffirming the commitment to Japan's defense in the face of what it termed provocative Chinese responses to the Japanese remarks. So I think the security treaty that we have, that is between US and Japan, covers the contested territories of the Senkaku Islands as well, even during this Taiwan Strait crisis, underscoring that it is the treaty's obligation to defend Japan, which remains intact under the current treaty terms. So
and Senkaku, and on Senkaku, in fact, the Chinese have been upping the ante, right? The intrusions and the provocations
This
have
is
been increasing.
one of the ongoing disputes between Japan and China, which is not yet resolved, and I don't think it is going to resolve anytime soon. So also coming back to the security treaty. So the security treaty of mutual cooperation and security was signed in 1960, and the original one was in 1951. So in exercise of these rights and under this treaty, I think Japan desires as provisional arrangements for its defense that the United States of America should maintain armed forces of its own in and about Japan so as to deter armed attack upon Japan. So I think if we see diplomatically, the US has urged restraint. According to some reports, during a recent call between President Donald Trump and Prime Minister Takaichi, President Trump allegedly recommended Tokyo to avoid further escalation with Beijing. So here we can probably assume that, of course, since President Trump has a trade deal going on with China, so he would want to maintain a careful balancing act. Also, Washington, on the same time, Washington is publicly backing Japan's security and its right to defend itself.
Yeah.
Also because of the treaty that I mentioned, because they have this obligation going on since 1950s and 60s. So Washington is publicly backing Japan's security and its right to defend itself, but is also signaling a preference for de-escalation. A US missile system was stationed in Japan during this entire tensions, which was the mid-range capability launcher at the Iwakuni prefecture of Japan, which was reportedly withdrawn. So this also possibly suggests that the US is also avoiding any provocative military postures that might trigger a broader confrontation.
Interesting. So the alliance remains strong, but at the same time, the US seems worried that they don't want to get dragged into a conflict on behalf of their ally, which is Japan.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, you can call it mixed messaging or even dual type of signaling out there. But that ambiguity, great powers always play those, even though they have a tight alliance with Japan and China is supposed to be their major competitor, they still try to maintain that. But let's, see if there is more clarity out of this, muddled kind of messaging that we are seeing. But coming back to you, Jyotsna, Taiwan, then we mentioned the Senkaku, there's a Paracel and the Spratly Islands, which China is claiming against Vietnam and the Philippines, and they are escalating military pressure on the smaller neighbors. Yeah. So in that context, what is the US role there? One view, and which we already mentioned, is that Trump is possibly going to be softer on China because he wants them to buy more soybean and farm produce, and he's saying that whoever is good to American farmers is good to me. So that element of the Trump has caused some jitters, it seems, in the region. So in this episode of over Taiwan, the China-Japan spat, what are you seeing in terms of the US signaling? Already there's some confusion there, but your reading of the American motivations and even their commitment to come to the rescue if Taiwan is actually attacked, or if Japan is attacked.
Yeah, I think there are no black and white answers here, at least for the moment. What we have here is, yes, you have President Trump, who doesn't have exactly a very traditional way of looking at the region. But then the US Trump administration is much bigger than President Trump himself. There are a lot of domain experts like Elbridge Colby and other people in the administration who are doing the everyday grueling work in keeping the alliance structure safe and stable. If you look at this episode itself, just during these tensions, the US finalized the first arms deal for Taiwan during tensions between Japan and China, something to the tune of $1 billion. And if you remember when President Xi and President Trump met during the APEC summit, President Trump was conspicuously quiet on Taiwan. So there is no this and that here, and we're operating in a muddled environment. What I would really say is that US interests in the Indo-Pacific are not going to necessarily erode just over these 4 years. And they form the very crux of what every US government would want to do, which would be to preserve US dominance. And I think that is what we should be looking at, even from an Indian lens. If we look at the Wall Street Journal report, wherein it was said that President Trump called Prime Minister Takaichi and asked her to tone down her rhetoric after a conversation with President Xi. Japan has actually denied that report. And a lot of people in India drew parallels between how President Trump was treating China, the aggressor here, and how President Trump sort of rewarded Pakistan after Operation Sindoor. That gives you a sense of how, in what kind of a complex space we're operating.
Right. It's a complex place, viewers. Not so easy to dissect what each of the main players intends and what their real bottom lines are. But coming to India now, let me bring in our two guests, starting with you, Simran. We have a special strategic global partnership with Japan. And whatever happens there in the East China Sea or even the South China Sea, that region, Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, does have an impact on our security as well, because if the Chinese are drawn in and are preoccupied there, it probably helps to ease some of the pressure on India and vice versa, right? So that has always been one of the cementing factors in the India-Japan friendship, a very special friendship. On the other hand, even though we are trying a rapprochement with China, it's, probably half-baked, and the provocations on the Chinese continue. We saw the episode about one of our citizens being harassed in Shanghai because she was from Arunachal Pradesh. The dam building that they're doing on the Brahmaputra is serious. And then, of course, the all-weather alliance or partnership they have with Pakistan through thick or thin, including during Operation Sindoor. So it's quite clear that, Chinese hostility or resistance to India's rise will remain. On the other hand, Japan wants India to rise. So clearly, there's no question of who we are aligned with. We are definitely aligned with Japan, right? So what more can Japan and India do in this kind of situation where the Chinese are, raising the tempo and are applying pressure on all their neighbors in some form or the other? Okay.
So as you rightly mentioned, and Jyotsna also mentioned about how we are operating in this complex security environment. And with this recent citizens case that we saw in Shanghai, I don't feel that India-China ties are going to improve anytime soon. And this entire special strategic and global partnership between India and Japan has been deepening ever since it was established in 2014 under Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and Prime Minister Narendra Modi. We have, India and Japan both have their common interest, first and foremost being countering China's expansionist behavior in the South China Sea, and protecting, of course, the entire Indo-Pacific region, including the Indian Ocean. So, although India and Japan have been engaging with each other on a regular basis through economic spheres, through defense exercises and all of that, I still feel there's a lot of room and potential for them to grow in the future so that they're able to, in some way or the other, counter Chinese capabilities in the behavior. So I think India and Japan can probably expand their tri-service exercises, like we've seen how India and Japan have been conducting the exercises with the army, their air self-defense forces, and then the seas, in the sea also. So I think they can expand this further by being regular in their joint exercises and conducting regular defense planning and dialogues. I think that would improve the defense cooperation between the two regions. Both countries also now have the ISR capabilities. So I think both they can...
Intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance.
Yeah. Both countries can also focus on coordinated monitoring of the PLA Navy, I think, through movements in that they can monitor PLA movements in the Indian Ocean and activity around Taiwan and the East China Sea. Also, if we look at the maritime security collaboration, I think both countries can cooperate more on the maritime coordination through coordinated patrols in the maritime domain awareness, the MDA sharing, and the joint protection of the critical sea lanes that I earlier mentioned, how it may get disrupted if China invades Taiwan. Also, during the COVID in 2021, we had this supply chain resilience initiative, which was between India, Australia, and Japan, which was a sort of trilateral cooperation. So I think this should be bolstered further, because if at all China invades Taiwan, we will experience the supply chain disruptions and all of that. So I think we know that Japan is trying to diversify out of China. So I think here also Japan and India can cooperate. We can increase investments through, like we can Japanese companies can sort of invest in India, which they were planning to.
That's the only way, that's the only message we can give to the Chinese. Jyotsna, your thoughts on India, Japan, and in the context of this China-Japan friction?
Yeah, I think we have to understand that this is the time for middle powers to come together and do more substantive work, because our region is experiencing greater major conflict risk. And especially because the administration in Washington is quite fickle about its commitments to the region, which means that countries like India and Japan, India and Australia, India, Philippines have to come and do more. Defense and security definitely is something which has to be strengthened. But interesting that we were talking about Arunachal. I think Arunachal and Northeast, there is room for greater Japanese capital and Japanese skills in investments in infrastructure, investments in the people there. More so because China is investing heavily in military logistics in their forward areas. And Myanmar and Bangladesh remain security concerns. So Northeast is definitely one area. And as China weaponizes visas, passports, and cartography, I think there is a need for India to have a look to revisit the Tibet issue. And perhaps here we could coordinate our view of that issue with Japan. Because unlike Western countries, Japan perhaps also looks at Tibet like we do from a more civilizational, cultural lens.
Spiritual, yeah, so, shared Buddhist values and all that.
I think that is an untapped issue, which probably controversial, but definitely worth looking at. And Japan has promised over the next 10 years to invest something in the tune of between $65 to $70 billion in India across AI and semiconductors, clean energy. So I think that we have to look at this relationship, and we're already doing that. Not just from a defense and security perspective, but from the larger comprehensive national power perspective.
Absolutely. Viewers, this conversation has revealed that the China-Japan conflict is not just a bilateral affair, and it involves the interests of most of the regional players. And of course, even the United States is involved as a resident power of the Pacific. But for India also it matters because the trends and the balance of power in that part of the Indo-Pacific will have a direct bearing on the western side of the Indo-Pacific, which is the Indian Ocean region. For us to protect our interests, our sphere of influence, we will need to think out of the box and expand the Japan-India special strategic and global partnership. So let me thank our two guests, Simran Walia and Jyotsna Mehra, for sharing valuable insights about a complex situation unfolding out there on the eastern end of the Indo-Pacific, and for showing the connections with India's own national interests. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you so much, sir.
Viewers, China versus Japan, you can talk about it as a civilizational conflict going back to centuries or millennia, or a more recent one. But the fact is, they share a long history of suspicion and of conflict and disputes going back in time. And now we are seeing an aggravated version of it over Taiwan, whose very existence is under threat due to Chinese push for quote-unquote reunification. So Japan has made it clear, crystal clear actually, more than anybody else, that they will fight to defend Taiwan because Japan's existence depends on it. The question is, what will everybody else do? What will the United States do? And even more interestingly, what can India do? Although we are not as close geographically to the theater of this current contention, what will India do if Taiwan is attacked? And we all need to think about it because the Chinese designs do not give us much room to feel very hopeful about a peaceful coexistence in the region. Thank you for watching. I'll see you again next time. Until then, take care.